the cause.
90% of disputed custody goes to women. That's not equal.
90%? That's a totally made-up statistic. Where are you citing that from? How many women die every year during childbirth?
Not many.
This country has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed country. So a lot of women do die as a result of pregnancy and childbirth, yes. This is painful, man. Do you have any other questions for me?
Not right now.
All right.
There's videos on the internet
see my
everywhere of
sister-in-law.
women getting their guns taken because they're not strong enough.
Are you just making things up?
No.
Pearl, what are you doing? Like, seriously. Next question.
I think I'm more of a feminist than you.
Sure. Go great. Congratulations. This is the longest 30 minutes of my life.
Okay, I'm going to interject again if I can.
All right.
So Ana Kasparian of the Young Turks, literal best friend of this channel right here, recently did an event in Atlantic City where she debated in person Hannah Pearl Davis. It was actually the headline debate. It was at an event called Word War One, which I will call World War One multiple different times throughout the course of this video. And although that premise on its own sounds ridiculous, Anna debating Pearl Davis on the issue of feminism, a topic that seems like it should be dated back to like 2014, the only thing more ridiculous than this particular premise was the fact that it actually happened, and Pearl Davis's performance was so embarrassing, so humiliating, so terrible that the much more prepared for this conversation Ana Kasparian actually suffered a little bit as a consequence of Pearl bringing literally nothing to the table. I mean, again, if you watch this debate, you will see that there are moments after moments of Pearl awkwardly pausing, repeatedly smiling awkwardly, looking at her piece of paper, not answering any of the questions brought up by Anna because she legitimately had nothing to bring to this conversation. She had nothing to bring to the table, and this is like a symptom of somebody who, if she ever does do a debate, it happens to be against like a 20-year-old OnlyFans model that doesn't know a lot of information, or somebody who does a show where she just asserts things time and time again, and nobody actually challenges them. So when Pearl actually had somebody in person challenge her, she folded or just kind of went into like a ball, like the equivalent of a fetal position on stage. And again, this was a humiliating experience for Pearl, and honestly for almost everybody watching this, because you have that secondhand embarrassment for her, and I know that Anna herself was feeling that embarrassment. Now we're going to get into this, but I do want to say thank you to the people running the Word War One Twitter account for actually offering me a ticket to come to this event. Thank you for Anna actually inviting me to this particular event. Unfortunately, I was booked on that particular day. There was no way I could have made it out to this event, even though I definitely wanted to, but I appreciate the offer. I appreciate trying to include me in some way, shape, or form in this whole process, even as an audience member, because yeah, I could have experienced this horrible cringe in person, and I probably would have died from it, but you know what? It was a death that would have been brought to me out of people wanting to include me, and I think that's really nice. But before we get into this, before we break this down, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money, okay? In a May 2024 appearance on Tim Pool's Culture War podcast, my opponent, Pearl Davis, declared that women aren't really doing much. We're not having kids. We're not really contributing to the economy when you look at output. In fact, she uses this ridiculous assertion to argue that women should not have the right to vote. While it's true the birth rate has declined, and we'll revisit that in a bit, women account for 47% of the American workforce. The Council of Economic Advisors found that women have contributed a substantial portion of the U.S. economic growth since 1970, which wouldn't have been made possible without the feminist movement. By 2017, women were responsible for nearly 40% of total gross domestic product, amounting to a whopping $7.6 trillion.
So look, I knew this was over from the opening statement where Ana actually referenced something that Pearl Davis said on a Tim Pool show. And the reason for this is because already at that moment in time, I knew for a fact that Ana had done significantly more research into Pearl than Pearl had done into Ana, and Pearl hadn't even spoken yet. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I knew this was over even before that, because both parties actually did a walkout at the beginning of this particular event, and you could just tell by the body language, by the layout of this, that it was going to be an uphill battle from Pearl, and some of that, because I'm the most gracious man in the United States of America, is not her fault. So first and foremost, Ana Kasparian is like a normal height woman. I believe she's like 5'3". Pearl Davis is closer to 6 feet tall, and you could see that the podium was not adjusted for Pearl. So this is something that's not Pearl's fault, because you end up having a situation where she has to hold her microphone because it's too low on the thing. It doesn't adjust properly. And this is just a mistake that hopefully the folks over at World War I World Debate thing fix in the future. I told you I was going to butcher saying that repeatedly throughout the course of this video. So in that regard, I do feel a little bit bad for Pearl. But in addition to that, I will also point out that Pearl did not represent herself well in a multitude of ways. First and foremost, the body language throughout the course of this debate told you everything you need to know. If you actually scroll through this and just look at how they're standing, look at their faces throughout the whole course of this conversation, what you realize is that the defeat is felt in Pearl's heart, in her soul, before they really even get into it. While Ana is actually projecting confidence, look at her posture, look at everything in the way that she's presenting herself versus Pearl. And also, I will point out, even though I'm not a fashionista, I'm not a doctor of clothing, that the way that both parties were dressed was also indicative of a lot, in my opinion, because Pearl looked like a disabled Catholic schoolgirl, and Ana Kasparian actually wore something that was flattering to her and seemed to fit the event that she was at. Now look, I don't want to focus too much on the superficial for that much longer, but the thing is, there's a reason why whenever you're watching a movie and you see a redhead in the movie, 9 times out of 10, that redhead is wearing green. It's because green contrasts really well with that color hair. It pops on video, and if you know you're going to appear on video, then maybe, kind of present yourself in a way that is suitable to that particular forum. But again, this is not the only problem with Pearl's performance, because every aspect of her performance was absolutely terrible, although she got one good line in like the whole 45 minutes, where she said that a woman should get a job just like a man, which ended up stirring up a reaction among the crowd.
That's equality. You don't want
alimony
equality.
Makes sense if the woman was a stay-at-home mother and doesn't have a source of income. How else would she take care of the kids following a divorce?
By getting a job just like the men.
Now again, told you I'm incredibly gracious. I try to give credit where credit is due. I try to be as fair as humanly possible. But now I think it's important for us to get into the annihilation of Pearl Davis at the hands of Ana Kasparian, because Pearl just had no substance behind her. And by the way, if you're somebody who watches Pearl Davis and you actually run down any of the statistics that she puts forward, you should not be surprised by this. She is the absolute queen of taking a headline statistic, basing her entire point on said headline statistic, and she did that repeatedly throughout the course of this. And I want to give you a couple of examples. You should watch the whole thing in its entirety. It will be linked in the description in order to prove my point. And one of the things that caught my attention immediately was this stat on male suicide that Pearl Davis ended up bringing up, which was that 1.6 million men have committed suicide since 1974.
There are millions of men that have died in this country from the political power that feminism pushes since 1970, an estimated 1.6 million men have committed suicide.
Time.
Again, you can go through the facts, the data, and the statistics and manipulate them any way that you want.
It's not
But
manipulation. Those are the stats.
There are 1.6 million men in this country. Men are 9 times more likely to commit suicide after a divorce.
Compared to women, what's the number for women?
It's lower.
Really? What is it? Comparative analysis is real difficult for you, isn't it?
Okay.
Go ahead, Pearl.
What's your next question?
Now, a lot of this debate was comparative analysis, so after Pearl ended up bringing up this statistic, Anna immediately asked her about the female comparison so that we could know the differential between male and female suicide. And by the way, Ana Kasparian, throughout the whole course of this debate, never disputed that men commit suicide more than women. I want to make that 100% clear, because people who are trying to analyze the debate and advocate for Pearl are pretending that she was being dismissive or hand-wavy to male suicide, but what Anna was actually trying to do was get a comparison so we could actually know what we were talking about. And the thing is, this is actually an example of Anna doing something good in the moment, because Pearl did not have an answer for that question. Instead, she deflected to, oh, why are we talking about women when I bring up men, as if this whole conversation wasn't comparative analysis between women and between men. But what's more important, in my opinion, is what this 1.6 million number actually is, because Pearl does a thing that is essentially like the underpants gnome's way of arguing, where she says something as part one of her argument, and then part two, you're just drawing a blank. There's nothing there. There's nothing to connect this to part three. And then part three is it's because of women.
There are millions of men that have died in this country from the political power that feminism pushes. Since 1970, an estimated 1.6 million men have committed suicide.
Time.
But the thing is, Pearl never actually makes that linear progression in order to actually prove that this 1.6 million men committing suicide since 1974 number is somehow the fault of women or the fault of feminism. And the reason she doesn't do this is because she doesn't even know what she's getting this number from. Now, let's say that this is a true, real, legitimate statistic, and maybe the reason why when I look it up it says it could even possibly be an overestimate is because Pearl tends to use outdated numbers, as she basically recycles the same talking points without updating them year after year after year. So we'll just concede that point for the sake of argument that 1.6 million Americans have killed themselves since 1970. However, I do want to point out that the United States of America has a significantly large population compared to other nations, so what we should actually examine is per capita suicide rates. And by the way, I have filtered this particular chart to display the male numbers to rank them on their male suicide rate, because we don't care about women's over here on this channel. Now, when you look at this particular chart, I don't think that this is a display of the most feminist nations in the world at the top, and in fact, you have to get all the way down to 26 for the United States of America to appear there, and again, this is after many, many countries that probably have less rights for women's in said country. I mean, are we blaming feminism for the male suicide rates in South Korea, or maybe it has to do with the fact that they have an achievement culture, and if you don't pass a certain set of exams, you're looked upon as a failure, and that is a lot of pressure, especially for males, even though, again, their female rate is actually pretty high, but we're not talking about that because we don't care about that. Also, we have Ukraine and Russia. Now, this is very likely due to the fact that we have a situation where both of these nations are at war, people are being forced into service, there are stresses with the military service, and neither one of these countries is really considered to be this top-tier feminist nation. In fact, a lot of propagandists talk about how Russia's the real trad Christian society, and yet they have a significantly higher rate than the United States of America. And by the way, even if you're going to say that this is skewed because of the war, even prior to the war, Russia ranked above the United States of America. Again, look at the nations that are displayed right here and tell me if you think that feminism or women's equality or gender parity is the biggest determining factor for these results. Or maybe are there other factors that are more crucial, and you would have to actually parse out whether or not feminism is the true cause, or women getting more rights, or if there is a link. Pearl never presented that, but she just throws it out there as a big scary number without an actual point behind it, and then when questioned on it, she just draws a blank. But then things get significantly stupider.
Why is it that every time we bring up men, you have to bring up women?
Because we're doing a comparative analysis here. You can't just throw out statistics without comparing it to what the rates are among women.
What I'm pointing out is, I just pointed out that by 2050, more men will have committed suicide than all of the world wars combined. And your first response was, well, women commit suicide too.
So Pearl says by 2050, male suicide will outrank the deaths of all the world's wars, which, again, I thought at first she said all the world wars, even though there were only 2 of them. But regardless of how you want to interpret what Pearl meant by this, it is completely false, asinine, and ridiculous. So that 1.6 million number is a number that, again, spans 50 years. Obviously, 2050 is approximately 25 years from now. The amount of people who were killed in World War II, if you guys are unaware, was actually 80 million people. So in order to make up for the difference of just World War II, just to be even if I grandfather in the last 50 years of male suicide statistics to just match World War II, you would have to have 78.4 million people take their own lives, and not people, men take their own lives in the next 25 years, which is an exponential increase, a great increase, an insane increase that you would not expect in the next 25 years of male suicide. This stat doesn't make sense however you interpret what Pearl was trying to say. If she was talking about all the world's wars, which again are tons of wars, if she was talking about the world's wars in the 20th century, again, tons of wars. If she was talking about both world wars, again, it doesn't make sense. If she was talking about either world war, it doesn't make sense because, again, it is just not based in any logic. Even with the suicide rate going up among men, it would not go up like 70-fold or 140-fold in order to match the deaths of even just World War II. Now, I know some of you might be typing in the comments that maybe Pearl meant all the casualties in America's wars total, like every single war America engaged in the history of the country, but the thing is that 1.6 million number is already higher than the 1.3 million estimated Americans to have died in combat since the history of the country. So again, she doesn't know what she's talking about.
And commentators can, they can try to minimize it. They can talk from their ivory towers and pretend it's not happening, but there's a genocide of millions of men that's going on in this country.
When you use the word
genocide?
I was going to say
1.6 million men commit suicide. Have committed suicide since 1970.
She also calls it a genocide at one point in time, and just to be clear, while male suicide is a serious problem, while men take their own lives more than women worldwide, in reality, in no way, shape, or form is this a genocide, as a genocide is the intentional destruction of a people in whole or in part, and it has to be done by an external party. It has to be a homicide. Quite literally, suicide cannot be a genocide. That is not a thing. So I don't know what the hell Pearl is talking about here. She's just grandstanding. And again, when challenged on this, she had nothing to rebut Ana with. And this was a pattern that we saw time and time again throughout this conversation. There's a point where Pearl says in one Midwestern town, they ended up discovering that 40% of the sexual assault claims were false. And then Ana asks, what Midwestern town are you referring to? What year are you referring to? Basic questions about this assertion that Pearl threw out there, and Pearl ended up acting like Ana was disrespecting flyover country or something.
Can you cite some actual studies that look at these statistics and back up what you say in regard to the outcomes of marriage and divorce in America?
41% of 109 rape cases reported to police in a Midwestern city were admitted to be false by complainants.
In one Midwestern city? And which Midwestern city was that?
You can go from your ivory tower and tell
I'm not in
people
an
what
ivory
to
tower.
think
I'm
and
on
how
this
to
debate
feel.
stage interrogating your assertions, and you've only provided an anecdote.
Because Pearl didn't actually know the town stats that she was referencing or the relevant year, even though she had this written down in her notes, which, by the way, she was awkwardly reading throughout the course of this conversation.
Women spend money all the time. You spend money on hair dye, you spend money on Botox, you spend money
You should think about it. I sure am.
You spend money all of the time.
Yep.
So you wanted to be men, here it is. You're equal. Pay for daycare.
Equality means that when you have a child or children, you're both
also, Anna told Pearl that she should look into Botox and plastic surgery, which was kind of hilarious and mean. Now, Pearl also has a bunch of completely ridiculous non-points that she brings up that may sound good, again, when you're doing your own show and there's nobody to push back on them, but when you bring them up as actual argument points in a debate, you realize that they're completely absurd and ridiculous.
Why do we have phrases like it's cheaper to keep her?
Pearl,
answer the question.
Divorce is expensive. And by the way, on purpose, to discourage people from getting divorced in the first place.
Why do we have phrases like happy wife, happy life?
Because it's true. Same with happy husband, happy life. I don't want to come home to an angry husband.
But that's not a phrase.
Do you have any other, catchphrase or slogan you want to throw at me?
So Pearl's like, why do we have phrases like it's cheaper to keep her or happy wife, happy life? And Anna ends up responding with, because it's true, and again, because divorce is expensive, and in addition to that, she says, yeah, it also goes the other way. Happy husband, happy life. She doesn't want to go home to an angry husband. And then Pearl says, why is that not a phrase? As if this is a great counter argument or rebuttal to that. But the reason why that's not a phrase is because it doesn't rhyme. Is Pearl's argument that in reality the English language for not rhyming husband with a synonym for life is somehow this egregious crime against men? No, that's absurd. We tend to have idioms that either rhyme or sound like they have a little bit of rhythm to it, and in reality, happy husband, happy life is not one of those things that has that ring to it. I guess you could do happy spouse, happy house, or something stupid like that, but do we really want to shift all of our phrases to be super gender neutral? That seems lame, progressive, and oddly feminist of Pearl Davis, but maybe that's actually what she's going for.
1/3 of paternity tests are negative by the American Association of Blood Banks.
Now, next up, we have Pearl bringing up the paternity fraud issue, and she's like, 1 in 3 paternity tests come back negative. And I'm assuming what that means is that 1 in 3 times somebody does a paternity test, it turns out that the alleged father is not, in fact, the father. But the thing is, this is a sample that has to do more with selection bias than anything else, because in reality, if you're suspicious enough to demand a paternity test, obviously there are increased chances that you will not be deemed the father of that child, because usually that suspicion is rooted in something. And I say usually, even though according to Pearl's statistic, when these suspicions do in fact exist, 2/3 of the time they're completely unwarranted suspicions. The father turns out to be the father of that particular child. So in 1/3 of the cases that are most likely to be indicative of some kind of sketchy behavior on the women's part, that's where you actually have the guy not being the father. And again, this is with the skewing of the sample in that there's enough suspicion in the first place in order to demand a paternity test.
Men are 9 times more likely to commit suicide after a divorce.
Compared to women, what's the number for women?
It's lower.
Really? What is it? Comparative analysis is real difficult for you, isn't it?
Okay.
Go ahead, Pearl.
What's your next question?
Now, another example of Pearl putting out a half-baked statistic is that right there. So what she actually meant to say is that men are 9 times more likely to commit suicide after divorce than women, although she leaves that second part out. And the reason she probably is leaving this out is because when she brought up this statistic against Trent Horn in a very similar debate, although much less messy compared to this one, what she ultimately ended up discovering is that Trent Horn had a rebuttal for that. And that rebuttal was, never married men commit suicide at higher rates than divorced men.
When Pearl brings up, divorced men are 9 times more likely to commit suicide, she's probably referring to the Kipaosa 2003 study. It's not that's not men are 9 times more likely to commit suicide who are divorced. They're 9 times more divorced men are 9 times more likely to commit suicide than divorced women. But that's only because men are just more likely to complete suicide anyways than women. They tend to choose more violent means to do it. So, but when you look at the data, never married men are still just as, if not more likely to commit suicide than divorced men. So that's the comparison fallacy once again. You talk about all of the risks related to marriage, and there are risks, but there are greater risks to being not married. So that shows marriage is not a bad deal. And as I said before, if marriage is such a bad deal for men, if it's so bad, why do 93% of men say they're willing to remarry their wives again if they had the chance? Why do 65% of divorced men choose and go and get remarried? It's because they recognize maybe someone wasn't right for them, but marriage was still right for them.
So even in the situation of divorce, where men's outcome in terms of suicide is 9 times worse than women, it is still way better off than men who were never married. Again, according to the numbers. And even though Pearl had this put right in front of her face in that Trent Horn debate, guess what? She's out here rehashing the same thing in this Ana Kasparian debate, because Pearl never actually consumes new information. She never adjusts her stats. And another perfect example of something that Pearl never adjusts is the fact that she's been saying she's interviewed over 1,000 men for like 5 years on YouTube, and she brings it up yet again in this debate.
My answer to this question not only comes from covering current events and researching the facts, data, and statistics, but also in my professional experience interviewing over 1,000 people in America and Western nations.
You would think that number would go up, and in addition to that, you would think at some point in time, Pearl would maybe realize that the kind of men that she is seeking out to do interviews with are obviously going to come with a specific perspective. I mean, imagine if I put out a call and I started doing a show where I was interviewing women who were bitter against men, and all I heard over and over again repeatedly were women's stories about how bad men were. And then I said, hey, look, on my show where I exclusively interview women who hate men, they tell me horror stories about men, therefore that is somehow data and not selection bias. You would find that absurd and ridiculous. It's like when Caleb Hammer interviews people that are in debt, and he's like, I interviewed 1,000 Americans on my show Financial Audit, and what I found out is that all these dumbasses end up going to Disney World when they're drowning in debt and they never pay their student loans. No, obviously the people who are on Financial Audit are on there for a reason. It's because they have bad spending habits, poor work ethic, they tend to defraud the welfare system, and all those commonalities that again come from the selection bias rather than the overall trend in society. Pearl, you got to do a little bit more than just say for the last 5 years you've interviewed over 1,000 men, because, you know, eventually somebody's going to call you out on it. Unfortunately, it wasn't in this debate. But there were even worse moments than that for Pearl. There was a point where Pearl was saying, what do you get out of marriage? And Ana ended up saying a bunch of things that you get out of marriage, which, by the way, a little bit of a sidebar thing. One of the things that I do like about Ana Kasparian is that she talks up her husband so much in public. She really shows genuine affection and appreciation for him. She did so on this debate stage. Actually, it's kind of strange that a left-wing person is making a solid case for marriage so vociferously on the internet.com, while somebody who is allegedly on the right is denigrating it in every possible way. And she ends up giving this rebuttal to Pearl on what she appreciates about being married, the importance of marriage, and Pearl does not compute this. She did not expect Ana to have a good retort to that. So then Pearl was like, pause, awkward.
Sell me on,
You
okay,
advise
Anna,
men to avoid marriage.
Sell me on marriage. What do men get out of marriage?
That's sad. It's sad that people think that. It really is. You get a partner, you get a teammate, you get to build a life together, and it's beautiful. I feel like misery loves company in this situation. And how would you know what you get out of marriage if you haven't experienced marriage in the first place? I'm not saying that as a personal attack. I really hope that Pearl meets the love of her life and gets married. It's not about that. But you trash it without really understanding what the benefits are.
And it's embarrassing to see. And again, I will point out that Ana was probably in her B form, not her A+ form. But the thing is, I think Ana was partially thrown off by how bad Pearl was during the course of this conversation, because for lengthy periods of said conversation, Pearl never gave Ana anything. I mean, there was a point in the conversation where Pearl brought up Amber Heard, and she was like, why is Amber Heard not in jail? She did false allegations, or false allegations, as the super mayor would call them.
False allegations and not facts.
And therefore, she should be locked up for those false allegations.
You guys want to believe women at the expense of men. Why isn't Amber Heard in jail? Because of the Me Too movement. You guys pushed believing all rape victims, and now we have rape.
Amber Heard had to pay out a massive settlement.
Yeah, but why isn't she in jail?
You want her in jail?
Yes.
Well,
he ruined his
the penalties
life.
for defamation are what the court's decision is, right? You want people to go to prison for defamation?
He had to go to 2 different countries to clear his name. Why isn't she in jail? He lost millions of dollars.
To be clear, you think the penalty for defamation is prison time?
I think the penalty for a false accusation is that the woman should get the same time that he would have gotten if he was found guilty.
Men don't go to prison for defamation.
But the thing is, I don't know if Amber Heard actually made false criminal allegations against Johnny Depp, which of course is prosecutable criminal, but what I do know, and what she did lose on, were the false civil allegations, the defamation of character, and guess what? She was punished under the civil court system, so maybe this isn't the best applicable example of somebody who got away with it when she very distinctly and famously did not get away with it. Now, of course, for a set period of time, during that Me Too era, she definitely 100% did seem to be benefiting from these allegations against Johnny Depp, but over time, the court system did work out. And by the way, this is due in large part to the fact that Johnny Depp is rich, he's famous, he was able to afford attorneys and all of that, he was able to get this trial on television so people could see it for themselves. But yeah, this was a case of Johnny Depp beating Amber Heard, beating her in the civil court system, not physically beating her, and not necessarily the greatest example for Pearl to bring up, especially when she's trying to say that there were no consequences for women. And by the way, Johnny Depp is starting to appear in more and more movies again. He has been accepted back into Hollywood. And Amber Heard, again, the person who made a lot of these false allegations against Johnny Depp, she has had her career get a major setback. So yeah, there's a lot there in terms of a victory for Johnny Depp, but Pearl brings this up as a random example. And while I don't want to stay focused on that, I think it's relevant because later on, Ana Kasparian brings up Jeffrey Epstein as an example, somebody who got a sweetheart plea deal in his original trial under the Florida U.S. attorney. He basically got a deal where he was free for most of the time he had to report to jail at night. And this is despite the fact that Jeffrey Epstein very famously had a much larger operation that abused a lot of female victims. And what's interesting about this is that Pearl refused to criticize Jeffrey Epstein.
Do you think it's fair that all of the young women who were preyed upon as minors by Jeffrey Epstein are now experiencing yet another administration engaging in a cover-up? Or was it the female's fault for being preyed upon by a disgusting pedophile? I'm just curious.
What kind of question is that?
I think it's a pretty straightforward one.
That has nothing to do with the topic.
No, it does, though, because you're talking about the unfairness of our court system, especially as it pertains to divorces. But we're talking about a guy who got a sweetheart deal after raping minor girls, and then even after that, multiple administrations, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter, engaged in a cover-up, ensuring that those victims would never get justice.
And this has to do with this.
I mean, you want to talk about the unfairness in the court system and how terrible it is for men. What about how terrible it is for women?
Look, that has nothing to do with anything.
It has a lot to do
I
with
think
what
in
we're
fairness, you
talking
got to admit that's an anecdote too in comparison to the overall statistics.
It's
Now you might be thinking to yourself, Sean, it is the easiest thing in the world to say Jeffrey Epstein bad. Jeffrey Epstein did bad things, but the thing is, that's because you're a normal, reasonable, rational person. But Pearl Davis in the past criticized an abusive male, an actually abusive male, and she got backlash from the crazies in her audience. So basically, she made like a pact with herself that she would never, and I mean absolutely ever, criticize any male for being abusive towards women. So in this particular case, she just refused to do so. And she talked about how it wasn't relevant, but again, considering she brought up randomly as a comparative example Amber Heard's treatment versus Johnny Depp, this opened the door for this to be relevant, and it was absolutely pathetic to see Ben Swann try to bail her out of this particular situation. And this is because Pearl died on the vine on this stage, and it was just embarrassing. I know I should have played this clip like 47 times throughout the course of this video, but let me just play it once so you guys can understand what I'm saying.
You do better when you're reading off your paper, so I'll give you some time to do that.
No, we're not doing that. That's embarrassing.
Again, pathetic in every possible way, but one of my favorite parts of this conversation was after this point, where Ben Swann started asking questions to the various people, because Pearl had shut down so many times that everybody was cringing throughout the course of this conversation. She was embarrassing on every possible level, so Ben was trying to progress the conversation because essentially they were running out the clock on a main event because Pearl was giving them absolutely nothing, and he ended up asking Pearl if she believes that things have gotten better, and she ends up saying no, and this made me laugh, which I'll tell you after you see the clip right there.
Pearl, in your experience, the men that you talk to, do you see a difference in terms of the age of those men, where maybe it's getting better for some, because I would take it that some of the guys who were a little older and have been through this in the past, the courts are starting to recognize and realize that maybe it's not very fair?
No.
No?
No.
Why, and why do you believe that? You think the courts are completely oblivious
there's men that write into my show every day just talking about how much they want to be fathers. So, I hope it changes, but right now I would say no.
And the reason this made me laugh is because this is like asking the head of CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, if Islamophobia is going down. This is like asking the head of the NAACP if anti-black racism is going down. This is like asking the head of the ADL if anti-Semitism is going down. These people's entire business model relies on you believing the opposite, that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism are growing problems in the United States of America, not shrinking. So Pearl cannot acknowledge that things have gotten better in any way, shape, or form. And you might think that that is backed up by reality, a reality that was not presented by Pearl. But I'll give you a perfect example of something that was presented by Pearl, because she mentioned something called the tender years doctrine.
Widespread issue when it's
the tender
only
years
10%.
doctrine is a sexist law against men.
Now, the tender years doctrine was, in fact, something that was discriminatory and advantaged females heavily when it came to child custody cases, based on the idea that women are more naturally nurturing. Therefore, the judge should weigh that more significantly when deciding who, in fact, gets custody more often, especially when it's in dispute. And while Pearl is talking about accurately how it is discriminatory and it does advantage the mother over the father during custody battles, what she doesn't mention is that the tender years doctrine has largely been repealed or deemed unconstitutional through various court challenges and changes in legislation throughout the various states in this particular union. And by the way, the same thing is true in the European Union. So she brings this up as an example. Later on, she says things have not gotten better, even though this is a perfect example of things getting better. It has actually been replaced by the gender-neutral best interest of the child standard. And while people might say that judges are still influenced by the ideas that harken back to the tender years doctrine, regardless of that, it is still improvement. It was something that was formerly discrimination in the law that has been removed from the law, but like the ADL with anti-Semitism, CARE with Islamophobia, the NAACP with racism, Pearl can never acknowledge that. And by the way, I question whether or not she even knows that for a fact, like if she actually pays attention to the things that she talks about. But of course, I want to know what you guys think about this whole debate and conversation down in the comments below. Should this have even happened? Did Anna annihilate Pearl, or did she absolutely destroy her? Let me know down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Pearl Davis getting destroyed and destroying herself on a debate stage versus Anna. Till next time.